Professor Jeffrey Sachs, we are honored to have you as our special guest for this interview for المصري اليوم newspaper and Egypt Independent, our English language newspaper. I will just want to start by asking you, whatever happened to the United States? You know, with the previous generation, the United States represented, you know, the defender of freedom, of the independence of the colonized nations in the world. And all these nations looked up to the United States as it emerged from the Second World War, holding up these principles of freedom and equality and democracy. With our generation, things have changed so much with freedom, with democracy, with all these things. And Egypt's, I mean, the United States image is now quite different from what it was. How did it come along that road and why?
First, let me say how honored I am to be together with all of you. Well, this is a bit of a sad story, and it, I think, was encapsulated already 60 years ago by a senator in the United States, Senator William Fulbright, who was the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee of the U.S. Senate. And he wrote a book 60 years ago called The Arrogance of Power. The United States was very powerful. It was technologically dominant. It was, because of the two world wars, untouched at home. It built its industry while Europe destroyed itself in these horrible wars. And so by 1945, the United States seemed to stand dominant in the world, as you say. And the U.S. did many great things in those years. My favorite president of all our presidents was Franklin Roosevelt, who led our country through the Great Depression and then through World War II, and his brainchild was the United Nations. So yes, the U.S. stood for a lot, and it stood as the pinnacle of technology, of science, and seemed to be the future. But as Fulbright said in the 1960s, arrogance can really get to you. We know that the Greeks used to say that to cause a powerful person to fall, it was to give them hubris. It was to give them this arrogance. Well, the United States increasingly thought, we're so powerful, we're so technologically advanced, we run the world. And that, of course, was a delusion, because no country should run the world. No country can run the world. But that idea was already present when the U.S. went to war in Indochina, excuse me, with Vietnam, with Cambodia, with Laos, with many other mistakes. But after 1991, when the Soviet Union ended, then this American idea, now we really run the world. Now no one can stop us. They couldn't even imagine China as anything other than an impoverished country of rice-growing villages. They thought there's no competitor anywhere in sight. And they thought, in a very arrogant way, not only do we run the world, we'll remake the world the way we want. And so they went to wars repeatedly, so-called wars of choice. In other words, not a war because you had to go to a war. You went to war because you thought, we can do that. And they did that too much in this region and in other regions. And of course, it was delusional, costly. These wars, just in the last 25 years, cost the United States about $7 trillion, which even for the US is a lot of money. Our debt has soared. Then China rose. Oh, that's nasty. How dare you be competitor? So the US has a very difficult mindset problem, which is there isn't supposed to be a challenger, but There's a powerful, large country, 4 times our population, technologically sophisticated, out-competing us in critical technologies. So that is really something nasty. Then, one after another, these arrogant ideas, oh, I'm sorry to say it, in Eastern Europe. Instead of taking President Gorbachev and President Yeltsin at their word that they want cooperation and peace, the United States said, well, no, it's not cooperation, it's the US in charge. We'll expand NATO. We'll expand NATO to Hungary, Poland, Czech Republic, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Romania, Bulgaria, Slovakia, Slovenia, the list goes on and on, Montenegro. It's unbelievable. They just got the idea, well, we should put our military everywhere. And now the US has military bases in 80 countries, 750 overseas military bases. What kind of country does that? Who needs 750 overseas military bases? It's a crazy idea, actually. Other countries don't have any, or China 1 or 2. So this is the basic answer, I think. The arrogance led to so many terrible missteps, so many misinterpretations of global reality, so much difficulty in just sitting down and having a negotiation with the other side rather than saying, you must do what we want. And that is where America has failed internationally. Domestically, there's another piece of the story which is quite interesting, and that is that our politics really got spoiled by big money starting around 50 years ago. You know, in the 1960s when I was growing up, and in the 1970s, there were environmental laws and worker safety laws, and the businesses said, we don't want this regulation. We need to take charge of the political system. And actually, one of the lawyers for American industry, a man named Lewis Powell, wrote a memo about how business should retake the government. And he was appointed on that basis to the US Supreme Court by Richard Nixon. And then as the Supreme Court Justice, he legalized all of the corporate money in our politics. And so what happened in the last 50 years, by a kind of design, is the US politics became a pure money game. This election cycle, for example, $10 billion will change hands. And we see in our newspapers every day, who are the billionaires behind Trump? Who are the billionaires behind Harris? Are you kidding? Are we really being governed by this group of billionaires versus this group of billionaires? But that's actually how we even discuss our politics, as if this isn't the weirdest thing in the world. Well, you know, when your politics are determined by billionaires on this side and billionaires on this side, here's a truth: the billionaires actually agree, which is, don't tax us, don't regulate us, let us get wealthier and wealthier. So the inequality in the United States has become so extraordinary, it's really 3 different countries. One country, which is more than half the population, is actually struggling these days. They've got health problems, addiction problems, falling life expectancy. It's incredible. It's hard to see America like that. Then there's say the professional class, and I'm part of that, and I know what it's like. Our salaries have gone up, our incomes have gone up for decades. And so we're very comfortable, but this is a relatively small part of American society. Then there's the third part. That's the billionaires. There are a few hundred of those. My God, their wealth, and their feeling that they don't owe anything to society, society owes everything to them, is really quite powerful, because they want everything. And if you say, why don't you pay a little wealth tax? Oh my God, how could you say that? Are you a communist? Are you this? And so this is the internal side of America. Externally, kind of a bully. Internally, deeply divided. And so Americans too are asking exactly the question you asked. If you ask Americans, are we on the right track as a country, around 20% say yes, or 25% maybe, and well over majority, maybe 60, 70% say no, we're on the wrong path. If you ask Americans, should we be in all of these wars, they say no, please stop it. Doesn't change anything. If you ask Americans, should we tax the wealthy, they say overwhelmingly, of course. Doesn't change anything. So Americans are asking the same question you're asking. What happened to our democracy? Well, it became a plutocracy inside, and it became an empire outside. And neither of those is really conducive to a good quality of life, I'm afraid.
الشروط القائمة اللي موجودة أو الموضوعية لحرب عالمية ثالثة، لأنه هو قال في جلسة بيتكلم على قصة التمدد العسكري الأمريكي، بيتكلم على فكرة مناكفة الصين، بيتكلم على السعي الأمريكي للحضور في جميع أنحاء العالم، والوجه الإمبريالي اللي كان بيتكلم عنه. فعايز أسأل ما هي شروط القائمة الموضوعية لفكرة أن تندلع حرب عالمية ثالثة؟
We have the conditions for a third world war, and Pope Francis often says we're already in a third world war because the situation is dramatic, actually. The war in Ukraine, I regard as not a war between Ukraine and Russia, but as a war between the United States and Russia because of the reasons for that war, and because actually the U.S. funds the war, it arms Ukraine, and I think from all that I know, there are a lot of U.S. Military personnel engaged in the war, whether they're giving the intelligence, whether they're programming the missile systems, whether they're using the U.S. satellite systems, they're already engaged. So we all are in a war. Obviously, part of that war is now a war in this region. It's a war that Israel is causing, but it's a war in which the U.S. is providing the funding and the armaments and the geopolitical backing. Almost all of the world is against what Israel is doing, but if you go to the UN Security Council, the U.S. gives the protection to Israel by using the U.S. veto. And the U.S. continues to provide every bit of the billions of dollars, all of the killing instruments, and Israel wants a bigger war. It wants a war not only on the Palestinian people, not only in Lebanon, it wants a war with Iran. God forbid, but it's trying to pull the U.S. into that war as well. And we have the potential for war in Asia because China's rise has created a psychological crisis in the American political leadership. In my opinion, China is no threat to the United States at all. China does not want to fight a war with the United States. China does not want to conquer the United States. China does not want to lead the world. China does not want to rule the world. China wants to be prosperous. It wants to be effective. It wants to have good friends around the world, but it's not out to defeat the United States. But from the U.S. mentality, China is a dire threat to the U.S. hegemony, as we say, the U.S. dominance. And so that is creating the conditions for the U.S. to provoke China into the same kind of conflict that the U.S. provoked Russia into in Ukraine. And the most likely war in that case would be Taiwan. Because if Taiwan were, for example, to declare its independence, and the Chinese said, no, you're part of China, you can't be independent, and the United States were to say, well, we will defend Taiwan, that would be World War III. So that's another risk. And all of these conflicts are part of this U.S. mentality, this fundamental U.S. mistake, which is rather than negotiating with counterparts and accepting counterparts with respect, like Russia, like China, with respect and dignity, and sitting down to negotiate, the U.S. still thinks it can just demand its way through its brute power. But this is impossible, and it's that mistake which could lead us to World War III.
If you allow me, I have a follow-up question. Does the ongoing conflict between Iran and Israel have the potential to expand into a major military conflagration?
Yes, it does, because Netanyahu's idea for 30 years has been, since he has never wanted to recognize the rights of the Palestinian people to their own state. And that has led to conflict throughout the region, political conflict. He says, well, then we have to change the region. We will never accept a Palestinian state, says Netanyahu, but that leads to resistance. Resistance from Hamas, resistance from Hezbollah, resistance from Iran. And then what Netanyahu has been saying, of course, for at least 30 years is, therefore we have to change the government in Syria, we have to change the government in Iraq, we have to change the government in Iran. This is his idea. His idea is get the U.S. to engage in wars on our behalf. And the Iraq war in 2003 was on behalf of Israel. The U.S. attempt to overthrow Bashar al-Assad, which was a CIA operation that Obama instigated in 2011. Netanyahu's idea right now to bring the U.S. into war with Iran is all his, I think, crazy, dangerous, and reckless idea that rather than simply having a Palestinian state, he would rather have a regional war to replace all of the potential backers of Palestine. This is a shockingly bad idea, but it's incredible that the United States has gone along with it all these years, because so far the U.S. has backed Israel at every point. I think even the Americans, even with all of this lobbying pressure and so forth, the Americans today know that this is very dangerous, what they are being pulled into every day by Netanyahu. But so far they don't resist, because Biden is a very weak president. He's at the end of his term. He's an old man. He doesn't have the energy to resist. And so the next weeks are actually quite dangerous, because we don't have a U.S. government with any clear leadership or authority or capacity to say no to Netanyahu. I want the whole rest of the world to be very clear. You must stop this. This is dangerous. It's unacceptable. It's a threat to the whole world. Israel must stop its attempt to create a region-wide war. And I think that message needs to be sent from this region very clearly, and it needs to be heard by the U.S., by Europe, and I think countries such as China or Russia can help to make that heard clearly. Nobody should want an expanded war, and I think nobody does except for Israel, actually.
في ظل الفوضوية اللي فيها النظام الدولي حاليا وفكرة سيادة القيم الغربية والحديث عن سيادة وتسيد القيم الغربية، كل هذه القيم تداعت أمام سكان المنطقة، وبالتالي الناس كلها بتسأل كيف سمح هذا العالم بكل قيمه وهذا النظام الدولي بكل قيمه بالإبادة الجماعية في غزة.
It's completely shocking. It's completely disgusting. It's completely awful. And it arises from the basic facts that we've been discussing. Israel is without limit and without compunction. In other words, it feels no guilt whatsoever at creating mass murder and mass suffering. And the United States, till today, has simply backed Israel, no matter what Israel is doing. And the power of the United States to arm Israel and to finance Israel's attack has been the dominant reason why Israel could continue every day, because if the United States said, you do what you want, Mr. Netanyahu, but we are not providing you with the munitions and the finances, Israel's war would stop immediately. So the U.S. is completely complicit in this. Now, why the rest of the world doesn't somehow act more decisively is another question. Europe, half of Europe says this is terrible, and the other half just does whatever the U.S. says. So this is part of the issue, that Europe does not speak with a united voice. Much of Europe just listens to the U.S. for its lead. The Arab and Islamic countries have said repeatedly, starting in Riyadh in November 2023, and then in Bahrain in the Arab League meeting in the spring of 2024, and then again in the last couple of weeks at the UN, that this region is ready for peace. It calls for peace. It calls for a two-state solution. And that message has been clear, but it's not heard in the West very clearly, because what's heard is Western propaganda. So what we hear is Netanyahu. There's no one for peace. They all want to kill us. There's no way to peace. He's a liar. He's a vulgarian. He's a murderer, in my view. But we hear his voice more than we hear the words from the Arab countries. When Netanyahu spoke at the UN a couple of weeks ago at the General Assembly, he gave a hate-filled speech, and he basically called on the world to attack Iran and expand the war and so forth. And he accused the UN of anti-Semitism and every kind of reckless words. Then, immediately afterward, the Jordanian foreign minister took a podium outside and gave a press conference standing next to the Palestinian ambassador, Ambassador Mansour, and said very clearly, I'm here, I'm speaking for the Arab countries, I'm speaking for the OIC, and I tell you, we want peace, two-state solution, and so on. Very good statement. But who heard it? It wasn't even reported in our media.
You wrote about it in your
Yes,
last opinion.
it wasn't even reported in our media. I went to a meeting with President Pezeshkian of Iran, newly elected. He's a heart surgeon. He's, from what I could see, a very nice man. And he spoke at the meeting that I was at. As a surgeon, he said, if I'm operating on a patient, I want to save their life. Even if they're my enemy, I'm a doctor. It's my moral duty. I try everything I can to save their life as a heart surgeon. He called for peace. He gave a peace-seeking speech at the UN. It wasn't even reported in our newspapers. So we're in the midst of propaganda or info war as well, dominated by Israel, dominated by the Israel lobby, dominated by this one side. What's my advice on this is don't give up, speak louder, more clearly. I think bring in China, bring in Russia, bring in other countries, to bring in Brazil, bring in the BRICS. The BRICS are going to have a meeting in just a few days in Kazan. Let the BRICS say two-state solution. This is the only way. We reject the Israeli slaughter. We reject the U.S. complicity in it. Let the BRICS say this very clearly so that the word gets heard at least, because that is very important for stopping all of this.
حضرتك قلت إنه البلد الوحيد في العالم اللي مش ممكن يحصل فيه انقلابات هو الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية، لأنه ما فيش سفارة لأمريكا في أمريكا. وأنا عايز أسألك يعني إيه اللي ممكن يحصل فيه انقلابات في المنطقة العربية بعد الدمار اللي حصل في عدد الدول الكبير، ولم يبقى تقريبا إلا مصر والسعودية من الدول اللي واقفة على رجليها. هل من المتصور أن يبقى في موقف عدائي أمريكي تجاه البلدين في الفترة المقبلة؟
The U.S. foreign policy for almost all of the period after 1945 was based on regime change. The idea is you don't have to negotiate with the other side, you just have to change the government of the other side. That's also Netanyahu's idea, which is we don't have to agree with the other side, we just have to overthrow their government. There are two kinds of regime changes: overt, meaning a war, and covert, meaning a CIA operation. And the CIA operations in this region go back more than 70 years. An example, of course, was Mossadegh in 1953, where Eisenhower and John Foster Dulles and Allen Dulles, the president, the foreign minister, and the head of the CIA, decided one day that they would overthrow Iran's government. They decided it sitting in the Oval Office of the White House, thousands of miles away, men filled with ignorance of Iran and its realities, but the CIA overthrew the government. And then the person who led that operation, Kermit Roosevelt, who was a grandson of Theodore Roosevelt, was welcomed back to the White House, and everyone smiled and patted him on the back for having destroyed Iranian democracy. So that approach to foreign policy has continued into the 2010s at least, because the U.S. overthrew the Ukrainian government in 2014, or at least participated in the overthrow of Viktor Yanukovych in 2014. The U.S. tried to overthrow Assad through the CIA and so on, and it failed. But it did lead to massive war. The U.S. overthrew Gaddafi, of course, through overt means, the NATO bombing of Libya. What now? Well, this behavior is so outrageous and so completely in violation of international law and so dangerous and reckless. First, on every point of principle, it must stop completely. It's completely unacceptable. Second, there are now counterweights to the United States. This is the most important point. China is a counterweight to the United States. Russia is a counterweight to the United States. I don't regret that. I favor a multipolar world. I don't want one country having that arrogance and that dominance, because it is so dangerous. So I think that if the world stays together on basic principles, and it's not exactly right that the principles are gone, the principles are still there. They are the UN Charter. They are the principles of international law. They are the International Court of Justice. They are the UN Security Council. If the world remains true to principles, then I think the United States can be pushed to behave properly again, because it is not so dominant anymore. It's only dominant in its own mentality, or if others believe that it's so dominant. But we are really in a multipolar world, and we should start to behave with multipolar and multilateral principles.
It's been more than a year now that the Gaza war has been raging. How do you think it will end, and when?
I don't know how it will end, but I have a good feeling how it should and can end. And what I would personally like is for the Arab League and the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, so the Arab League and the OIC, to put forward its peace proposal. The peace proposal is 2 states, Palestine on the borders of the 4th of June, 1967, capital in East Jerusalem, control over the Islamic holy sites, both countries secure, a demilitarization so that there's security of both sides, and admitting Palestine as 194th UN member state immediately. And I think China, Russia, Brazil, the BRICS, the non-aligned countries, the G77, and half of Europe would immediately say, yes, we agree with the proposals of the Arab League and the OIC. This is the only way forward in peace. Then we'll have a new government starting on January 20th. We'll have a new president-elect as of November 6th. Whichever candidate it is, they could accept that plan. If you wait for the US to come up with the plan, you'll wait another generation. If you wait for Israel to come up with a peace plan, you'll wait forever. It's got to be put in place by the United Nations, but write it. This region understands how to make peace, put forward a viable plan based on the principles that have been enunciated, show that the big powers other than the United States are all behind it, show that China's behind it, that Russia's behind it, that the other countries of the BRICS are behind it, and then say to the new US president, whoever it is, either you can have more war, bloodshed, World War III disaster, or you can make peace and keep America having a standing in the world rather than the complete disrespect and indeed growing hatred around the world for its complicity in this bad behavior. My own feeling is that can work. That's what I would recommend.
Thank you very much, Professor
Thanks
Sachs,
a lot.
for giving
Great.
us this time.